So now this is 2 of 3. We're on slide 11. This is a map that shows the position of the 4 major daimyos and their fiefdoms, as well as the area controlled by the shogun himself. And you can see that the area controlled by the 4 major daimyos and by the shogun makes up only a small part of the Japanese home islands. The uncolored areas are not unoccupied or independent or anything. They were the area that was taken up by the other 255 or 256 daimyos, the smaller fiefdoms. And it's probably no accident that opposition to the shogun Bakufu government was centered in the south, with daimyo who were the first to deal with foreigners. Another reason, I think, may be that these areas are in the part of Japan that is the most agriculturally productive. But I'm not schooled enough. I'm a generalist when it comes to Asia. My specialty is China. Therefore, this is my idea that I've formed over the years, and from doing these kind of readings, I have not done any original research in that area. Satsuma and Choshu are said almost as in one phrase in accounts of history of this time, because they were the 2 places where opposition to the Tokugawa became most vociferous, and because they reached an eventual secret agreement to act against the shogunate that led to its downfall. Let's go on to slide 12. So this listing of worsening sources of domestic tension shows that Japan faced a decades-long problem of rising internal stability. When we study history, we often forget that major developments really do take a long time. Decades for significant change is not uncommon. An important development here was that the shogunate kept secret information about what it knew concerning alarming overseas developments like the Opium War from 1839 to 42 that led to the loss of Hong Kong to China, from China to Britain. Now, ultimately, this meant that many daimyo who were needed by the shogun to stay on the same side in responding to foreign threats reacted with ignorance instead of completely understanding the concessions that the shogun's representatives were making to the foreign powers as they closed in on Japan. Concessions that were actually rather rational moves under the circumstances. So this is certainly a cogent argument for open government, and it has nothing to do with the virtues of democracy. It's entirely practical as a viewpoint, that when it becomes politically difficult to convince a group of people, whether they are a large group or a small group, of what needs to be done, it doesn't help to treat them like mushrooms, like keeping them in the dark. It's much better to have a fully informed polity when you're trying to get people to move in one direction in a difficult situation. Anyway, enough of that. Let's go on to slide 13. Naiyu Gaikan, or Neiyu Waihuan, originally a Chinese term from Confucian writings, was the idea that when there are internal problems and external problems all at once, that can lead to instability that overthrows a government or results in a government falling, dynasty falling, loss of the mandate of heaven, that sort of thing, which we'll talk about more next week. This kind of traditional Chinese thinking led people to believe that the combination of internal disturbances and sudden challenges from abroad could mean the end of the Tokugawa government, and indeed this proved to be correct. In spite of the fact that the senior daimyo Ii Naosuke skillfully negotiated a reasonably decent deal with the powers to open Japan, starting with the Americans and following with others, principally the British, there was no sympathy on the part of other daimyo, and in particular the emperor, who was very anti-foreign in his view and did not want to give in to foreign pressure to open ports. A similar reaction would occur later in World War II, and by that I mean that there was a reaction against not only foreign people themselves, but also Japanese who were acquainted with foreigners, Japanese who even studied foreign languages. And if you read the Fukuzawa biography, there's a portion in there where he discusses how afraid he was and how afraid other people were, those who were engaged in the Dutch learning, in learning foreign languages. They would be cut down on the street because they were identified as people who wanted to understand what was going on overseas. It seems like a reaction that goes back to what happened when Japan was closed in the first place in 1635, because of the idea that people who had contact with a foreign power could instigate rebellion. In our minds, that may seem ridiculous, but in the minds of people at the time, isolation from foreigners seemed prudent. Let's go on to slide 14. The Americans had, at least in the 6 or 8 years before the Civil War, from 1860 to 65, in other words, in the 1850s, the Americans had the strongest imperative to force Japan to open up trade and diplomatic relations when compared to the other powers. They had just acquired Oregon and California. They were considering the advantages of reaching into the Pacific. Trade with China in the wake of the Opium War, ending in 1842, would require passage near Japan, and the islands would make a good coaling station for the ships of the time. The British and the Russians were also interested in opening up Japan, but they were busy with other matters and exploiting China, and Japan was a longer voyage for them than was China. You have to remember that for the Russians, this is certainly obviously true for the British, and for the Russians there was no Trans-Siberian Railroad at that time, certainly no modern transport of any kind. Vladivostok in the Russian Far East on the coast, just above North Korea, was supplied by sea. And so it was the Americans who had the most direct route to Japan. When you cross the ocean from the United States, the first place you come to is Japan, not China, not Singapore. But when you come from Europe, the first place you come to is Singapore, and then southern China, and then at the end of the line is Japan. So the Europeans were content, since they were occupied elsewhere with the Opium War, the Arrow War, and so on, to allow the Americans to take the lead, because they knew that once the Americans reached a agreement with Japan on trade and diplomatic relations and so forth, that they could piggyback on that, just as they've been doing with each other in China over the last decade or so. So, as we mentioned a little while ago, the powerful daimyo gave license, had been given license by the shogun to reach an agreement. The powerful daimyo Ieyasu, he was assassinated for his efforts by anti-foreign extremists who felt that they had a license to kill him, since the emperor and other important daimyos were not consulted in this treaty, and they considered Yi to be, in essence, a traitor. Let's go on to slide 15. Another movie to be wary of. It's an amusing story, but this and 55 Days in Peking are not among those that I assigned for this course. However, in spite of their low historical quality, they're actually useful if you wanted to work with the extra credit project to make a comparison between films of this ilk and the ones that I've assigned, which I believe are of more historical merit. If you're interested in that, please see the syllabus and talk to me to reach an agreement on a good quality extra credit project. Let's go on to slide 16. So after Ieyasu was killed, this opened up a period of assassination that unraveled the shogunate. Many thinkers like Fukuzawa realized that the country needed to be unified, and that Japan could not go back to its old ways and stand up to the foreigners and survive. However, they had not yet really made the connection that government and control of the economy had to change in ways that had been unimaginable to that point. There was this realization that they needed to centralize their decision-making, in other words, but they were still stuck in the old style of government and economic development. Okay, let's skip slide 17 and go on to 18. So what was this Meiji Restoration? The restoration part is the idea that the emperor was being restored to direct rule over society. However, that was for popular consumption. It was only slightly true. There was no longer, the idea was that there was no longer going to be a shogun in between and a daimyo in between, politically speaking, that there would be an emperor who would have final say as a last resort if there was disagreement among major decision makers. However, the major decision makers remained the same sort of people, but their positions in society and the nature of the allegiance they owed to the central government and to the emperor did change dramatically. So you can see a series of steps that occurred here that gradually changed society, completely turned society around, that completely replaced the government structure and implemented an economic and cultural revolution of sorts. However, a lot of this was by trial and error, and this is particularly true in the attempts to properly administer the peasantry, not to tax them enough so that they would support through their labors, that their labors would support the industrialization of society, but not do it to such a harsh extent that they would rebel as had happened many times in the 1820s all the way through to the 1880s. These processes are well described in the Beasley reading, and I've tried to summarize them here. All right, I'm going to end this recording and start recording number 3.